Have you ever felt like your country is invisible in the great sweeping stories of the Bible? Like those sacred pages were written for far-off lands, and somehow your home, your people, were left out of the narrative? But what if that wasn't true? What if your homeland was not only present in those ancient words, but carried a hidden mission, one greater than anyone ever imagined? Let's take a journey, not through geography, not through dry history, but through a mystery, a spiritual thread that may have been hiding in plain sight. Far to the east lies a nation made up of over 7,000 islands, a place battered by storms, shaped by struggle, and yet burning with unshakable faith. Often labeled as a vacation spot or forgotten in the shuffle of world politics, the Philippines is much more than meets the eye. Could it be that this seemingly quiet corner of the earth has been chosen for something extraordinary? Is it all just a coincidence? Or were these islands always meant to be seen, to shine, to stand like a city on a hill, radiating light into the darkness? This is not a history lesson. This is not a travel brochure. This is a spiritual unveiling, a question that might just lead to a revelation. 1. The forgotten prophecies in the islands of the East. They say prophecy is like a whisper, soft, elusive, often overlooked, until one day it becomes thunder. And if you listen closely, tucked within the old pages of Scripture, there are whispers about lands and peoples many of us have skipped over. Words we've written off as poetic, outdated, obscure. But what if those words were never meant to be metaphors? What if they were signposts pointing us towards something we've missed? One such whisper is found in Isaiah 24:15. Therefore, in the east, give glory to the Lord. Exalt the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, in the islands of the sea. At first, it sounds like a broad blessing, vague, unspecific. But look again. It doesn't just say, give glory anywhere. It says in the east and in the islands. Not mainland, not mountains, islands. For centuries, theologians guessed this east must refer to nearby lands, maybe Babylon, Persia, regions just beyond Israel. But the phrase islands of the sea breaks the frame wide open. The original Hebrew doesn't mean tiny nearby isles. It means distant lands, far-off territories across the water, places at the edge of the known world. And in the time of the prophets, what was east of east? Beyond Persia, beyond India, beyond the ends of their ancient maps. The wide, mysterious waters we now call the Pacific Ocean. There, on the edge of Asia, lie thousands of islands, facing the sunrise, battered by waves but burning with worship. The Philippines. Could these be the very islands Isaiah saw in his vision? Not just any islands, but those islands. Islands that would glorify the Lord. Not eventually, not metaphorically, but in reality. It's not a new theory. And yet it's one that's been whispered about, often ignored. Some scholars dismiss it as spiritual symbolism. Others cast the net elsewhere. Japan, Indonesia, the broader Pacific. But still, the question remains, what if the Philippines has always had a role to play? Not just because of geography, but because of destiny. Throughout the Bible, islands are more than places. They are symbols of people once far off, out of reach, distant from the spiritual centers of power. And yet God never forgets them. In Genesis 10, as Noah's children spread across the world, the islands represent new beginnings. In Isaiah 42:4, we read, "The islands will wait for his law, not abandoned, not lost, but waiting, expectant, part of the plan." And still today, few dare to connect those ancient prophecies to modern places. It feels safer to keep things vague, to speak in riddles. But prophecy doesn't come to make us feel safe. It comes to wake us up. So look again at the Philippines. What do you see? A collection of islands? Or a nation standing at the edge of something divine? Because what began as a whisper might just be the sound of destiny calling. 2. A light in the east and the forgotten gold. Imagine a nation scarred by storms and shaped by centuries of struggle, poverty, colonization, natural disasters, and yet it stands tall as the most Christian country in all of Asia. Over 86% of its people identify as Christian, not just in name, in life. They crowd into churches, not only on Sundays, but every day of the week. Their prayers ring out in alleyways and marketplaces, in quiet, candlelit corners of cathedrals. Their festivals pulse with songs of devotion. Their stories drip with faith. Here, belief isn't a background tradition. It's the air people breathe, the rhythm of the nation's heartbeat. But how did this happen? How did a scattered group of islands, thousands of miles away from Jerusalem, cut off by oceans and centuries, become a lighthouse of faith in the Far East? History gives us answers. The arrival of Spanish missionaries, the fusion of the cross with culture, the way Catholicism rooted itself into the soil of Filipino identity. Faith that didn't erase the local spirit, but wove itself into it. But even history doesn't feel like a full explanation. Could there be something deeper, something older, something not just historical, but prophetic? What if these islands were waiting all along? Waiting, just as Isaiah wrote, for his law. Waiting for the light to find its way through the sea and dawn on distant shores. What if this wasn't coincidence? What if this was calling? Because when you stop seeing the Philippines as a nation born by accident and begin to see it as a people written into the margins of biblical prophecy, something shifts. These islands aren't just tiny dots on a map. They become beacons, chosen lands, patiently holding their place in the divine timeline. And maybe that time is now, because the world grows darker every day. Hope feels harder to find, but the Bible tells us that no light, no matter how far-flung or fragile, escapes God's attention. The islands of the sea, that's not just poetic language, it's a promise that one day, the furthest corners of the earth will rise in praise. And maybe, just maybe, the Philippines is already singing that song. 3. The Ofir mystery and the golden secrets of the East Gold. It's more than metal. It's a magnet for human desire. It's driven kings to madness, empires to war, and explorers to the edge of the world. But in the Bible, gold carries deeper meaning. It symbolizes glory, value, and divine presence. And there's one place above all that captured ancient Israel's imagination, a place called Ofir. In 1 Kings 10:22, we're told King Solomon had ships that sailed with the fleet of Hiram. Every 3 years they returned, laden with treasure, gold, silver, ivory, apes, peacocks, and gold from Ofir was no ordinary gold. It was the purest, the most dazzling. So sacred it became a symbol of the kingdom's unmatched splendor. But here's the mystery. No one knows for certain where Ofir actually was. Scholars have debated it for centuries. India? Africa? Arabia? But what if the answer doesn't lie westward, but eastward? What if the famed land of gold was not at the edge of the desert, but at the edge of the sea? What if Ofir was hiding all along, in the islands now called the Philippines? Sounds unlikely? Maybe at first, but look closer. Long before Spanish galleons ever sailed the Pacific, these islands were known across Asia as the Islands of Gold. From the riverbeds of Luzon to the highlands of Mindanao, gold wasn't just a luxury, it was everyday life. Tribes mined it, crafted it, wore it. When the Spanish first arrived, they were stunned. Fishermen, farmers, ordinary villagers wearing gold earrings, necklaces, bracelets, not royalty, not elites, just people. Gold wasn't a distant treasure here. It was part of the people's identity, their art, their story. And then there's the peacock. The Bible lists peacocks among the cargo brought back from Ofir. Peacocks aren't just found in India. They exist in Southeast Asia, including parts of the Philippines. Is it coincidence? Or are we looking at clues? Because ancient maritime trade was far more advanced than many assume. Ships in Solomon's time could harness the monsoon winds, reaching across the Indian Ocean, skirting Southeast Asia's coasts, and beyond those coasts lay the Philippines. A rich land, a golden land, a place of beauty, mystery, and perhaps biblical importance. Maybe Ofir was never lost. Maybe it was simply waiting to be seen. And maybe the Philippines was never just a collection of islands. Maybe it was a treasure chest, tucked away on the edge of the earth, holding more than gold, holding a purpose. The echoes of Ofir and the spiritual gold of the Philippines. The islands of the Philippines have long been more than a beautiful backdrop to history, more than a tropical paradise stamped on a postcard. They were strategically placed, a natural crossroad between East and West, a resting place for ships that carried not just cargo, but culture, language, and faith. Ancient trade routes once curved like ribbons across the oceans, and the Philippines was right there, a living, breathing gateway between the Pacific and the ancient world. But even that doesn't begin to capture the mystery, because hidden beneath those green hills and deep rivers lies gold, not just in legend, not just in folklore, but real, tangible gold, pure, intricate, astonishingly crafted. Archaeologists have uncovered treasure troves in the soil of these islands. Gold jewelry, ceremonial pieces, masks, bowls, each one whispering of a lost era. One of the most breathtaking discoveries is the Surigao treasure, a dazzling collection of ancient gold artifacts buried deep in the heart of Mindanao. Crafted not by accident, but by skill. Not by outsiders, but by hands that knew the land. Necklaces twisted with intricate designs, funeral masks forged with reverence, golden bowls that once cradled offerings to forgotten gods, or perhaps to the one true God, whose presence stirred the hearts of people long before modern faith found them. And it makes you wonder, could these treasures be echoes of something ancient? Could they be the long-lost remnants of a land once known to Israel as Ofir? The Bible paints Ofir as a land of unimaginable wealth, a place so distant, so rich, that King Solomon sent ships there, returning years later with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. It wasn't just trade, it was marvel. And while scholars have chased the location of Ofir across continents, some saying India, others Africa, no one truly knows. It remains one of the great mysteries of the Bible. But maybe it was never meant to be found on a map. Maybe it was never just about longitude and latitude. Because even Solomon, the wisest king who ever lived, looked at the gold of Ofir and declared it meaningless. In Ecclesiastes, he writes of wealth and glory as vapors, fleeting, vanishing like mist in the morning sun. So what if Ofir was real, and yes, maybe even located in what we now call the Philippines? But the treasure it pointed to was never in the gold. Maybe the gold was just a mirror, a symbol, a reflection of something deeper. And maybe that is what the Philippines has carried all along. Yes, this land is rich in gold, in rivers and mountains and buried roots. But its greatest wealth? It lives in the hearts of its people. A faith that sings in the storm, a hope that outlives disaster, a love for God that cannot be washed away, even by waves of history or heartbreak. And maybe that's the real mission. Not to prove that the Philippines was Ofir, but to ask what Ofir was always trying to tell us. That true treasure isn't found in what we hoard, but in what we give. That the greatest export of these islands was never gold, but grace. Not ivory, but identity in God. Not riches, but a radiant faith that refuses to die. And maybe the Philippines, once called the Islands of Gold, has now been chosen to shine in a different way. To send not ships of treasure, but waves of faith, of prayer, of salvation across the world. Because one day, every crown will be laid down, every treasure will fade, but the gospel carried by humble, storm-tested hearts that will shine forever. 3. The Philippines, spiritual battlefield of the East. When we talk about battles, we usually think of blood and armor, of armies marching, of kingdoms colliding. But there are other battles, fierce ones, invisible ones, fought not on open fields but in the soul. Battles where the weapons are not swords but faith, not bullets but belief. The Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians 6:12, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness, against spiritual wickedness in high places." This war is ancient, unseen, and global. And yes, it has reached the shores of the Philippines. At first glance, it might not seem like a battlefield. Palm trees, beaches, smiling faces, a land surrounded by beauty. But if you look closer, if you see with spiritual eyes, you'll see the scars. The Philippines has endured some of the deepest wounds any nation can bear. Colonization, corruption, catastrophe, typhoons that tear entire towns apart, earthquakes that crack open the ground beneath families, poverty that pushes people to their knees, not in defeat, but in prayer. Because here's what sets this battlefield apart. Despite the darkness, they still kneel. Despite the loss, they still praise. Despite the brokenness, they still believe. In 2013, Typhoon Yolanda, one of the most powerful storms ever recorded, smashed into the central Philippines. Over 6,000 lives lost. Cities turned to dust. Hope buried under rubble. The world watched in horror. But the cameras caught something else too. Something holy. Men and women in the streets, kneeling in the mud, hands lifted toward heaven, singing, singing. That's what makes the Philippines a spiritual battlefield. Not because evil attacks, but because faith fights back. This is not a land of victims. It is a land of warriors, spiritual ones, people who know how to worship in the wreckage, who know how to pray in the flood, who know how to believe even when everything else is gone. Maybe that's why the Philippines matters in the grand story. Not because of its gold or its location or even its beauty, but because it shows the world what unshakable faith looks like in the middle of the storm, in the ashes of loss. When the lights go out and the world forgets, the Philippines remembers God. And perhaps in doing so, it becomes a light to the rest of us, a living sermon, a battlefield where faith doesn't just survive, it wins. How do you explain that kind of faith? How do you explain a faith that doesn't collapse under pressure, but sings through it? A faith that isn't shaken by disaster, but sharpened by it. A faith that doesn't fade in the dark, but burns brighter. Some say it's cultural. Some say it's just the result of resilience. Tough skin born from centuries of hardship. And yes, those things may be true. But maybe it's something more. Maybe the Filipino people understand something that much of the world has forgotten. That the storms we see with our eyes are only shadows of storms raging in the unseen world. That the battle is real. That prayer is not just tradition, it's warfare. That worship is not just music, it's a weapon. Because here, in a region where Buddhism, Islam, and ancestral beliefs have deep roots, the Philippines stands alone, a defiant candle in the wind. A Christian nation in the heart of Asia. That's not an accident. That's not coincidence. That's purpose. The Philippines is a spiritual front line, a lighthouse in the east. But here's the truth about lighthouses. They don't hide from storms. They stand in them. They absorb every crashing wave, every gust of wind, every attempt by darkness to swallow the light. The Philippines knows this all too well. Corruption, poverty, crime, disaster. These aren't just social issues. They are spiritual strongholds, and yet, time and time again, the people rise. They fall to their knees in prayer. They rise with hope. They forgive. They rebuild. They refuse to let darkness win. But the story doesn't stop at the shores of these islands. Because today, over 10 million Filipinos live and work overseas, scattered like seeds to every corner of the earth. In the hospitals of New York, in the towers of Dubai, in the homes of Rome, you'll find them, nurses, caregivers, engineers, teachers, laborers, sailors. But they don't just carry their skills, they carry their faith. They bring prayers that whisper through apartment walls, songs that fill kitchens, stories that spark hope in the quiet hearts of strangers. They start prayer groups in the shadows of mosques. They read their Bibles behind closed doors. They gather in small rooms, low-lit and hidden, to worship with all their hearts. They are, in every sense, the quiet missionaries of the 21st century. They don't need pulpits. They don't need stages. They preach through love. They witness through patience. They evangelize with joy. And maybe, just maybe, in God's eyes, they are just as mighty as the warriors of ancient Israel. Because here's the secret. The greatest battles aren't always loud. Sometimes they look like a mother comforting a stranger, a caregiver holding the hand of someone taking their final breath, a worker giving thanks in a language no one around them understands, except heaven. The Philippines is more than a country. It is a spiritual fortress, a training ground for modern-day faith. It's proof that you don't need power to be powerful, that you don't need riches to be rich in spirit, that battles aren't always won with noise, but with knees bent in prayer. Sometimes the greatest victory happens when a mother thanks God in a flooded shack. A father prays from a foreign land with a cracked phone screen and a tearful voice. A church gathers by candlelight, knowing the power is out, but the light has never left. So the next time you hear about the spiritual warfare of the Bible, don't just imagine ancient cities or distant deserts. Picture the Philippines. Picture its people, humble, joyful, unbreakable. Know that the war between light and darkness is still raging. And on these islands, battered by typhoons but never by doubt, the battle is being fought every day. And maybe the Philippines is not just a battlefield. Maybe it's a symbol, a reminder to the world that even in the fiercest storm, even at the edges of the earth, the smallest light still shines the brightest. 4. The Philippines and the global mission. Now, I imagine this. It's a Sunday morning, a small church in New York, or maybe in the heart of Dubai, or perhaps a quiet town in Italy. The congregation begins to gather. The music starts, voices rise, and there, leading the worship, serving the communion, lifting hands in praise, are the familiar faces of Filipinos. How did they get here? How did a people from a distant archipelago in Southeast Asia come to stand at the heart of churches around the world? Is it just economics? Is it just chance? Or is something more at work? Could it be that the scattering of millions of Filipinos across the globe is not a migration, but a mission? A mission not orchestrated by government policy or economics, but by God Himself. Today, over 10 million Filipinos live and work overseas, but wherever they go, they don't go alone. They bring more than their labor. They bring their light. They bring their songs, their prayers, their fellowship. They bring the presence of Christ. In the Middle East, where Christianity is often whispered, not shouted, Filipinos quietly organize worship gatherings, underground churches, midnight prayer groups, faith in secret, but burning like fire. In Europe, in Africa, in the Americas, you'll find Filipino believers keeping the flame alive in places where churches are growing cold. And they're not always pastors. They're caregivers, nannies, cleaners, cooks, but they carry the kingdom in their hearts. This is no accident. This is a global mission, a divine strategy to place light in the darkest places, to send humble hearts into high places, to show the world that you don't need a microphone to preach. You just need a life that reflects Jesus. The Philippines is not just a sending nation. It is a sent nation. And maybe that's the story being written even now, that in the last days as darkness grows, God would raise up an army not of warriors in armor, but of servants with towels, workers with faith, families with fire in their bones. And maybe the Filipino people were never scattered. Maybe they were planted in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Qatar. They gather in secret, in living rooms, in back alleys, in borrowed spaces, sometimes by candlelight, sometimes in whispers, always with boldness. Filipinos, ordinary workers in extraordinary situations, lift their voices in worship, even when it comes at a cost, even when eyes are watching, even when it's dangerous. Why? Because their faith isn't casual. It's not a decoration. It's who they are. It's woven into their identity, into their songs, their smiles, their suffering. In the United States, the story is different, but just as powerful. Filipinos aren't just attending churches. They're leading them. In Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Honolulu, they stand behind pulpits, they direct choirs, they mentor youth, they organize missions. They carry with them a faith that is not loud, but deep, not flashy, but firm. It's a faith shaped not in comfort, but in trials, not in abundance, but in gratitude, and it's spreading. But it's not just in wealthy cities or safe spaces. Filipino missionaries are going where many fear to go, into the mountains of Africa, into the remote corners of Asia, into small villages in Latin America. They bring food, they bring medicine, they build schools, they dig wells, but above all, they bring hope. The kind of hope that says, you are not forgotten. The kind of love that crosses borders, cultures, and languages, because it comes from a God who does the same. But why the Filipinos? What makes them so different, so faithful, so willing to go? What makes them the kind of people God seems to use again and again? Maybe it's because they've learned to hope even when things fall apart. Maybe it's because they've learned to sing in the storm. Maybe it's because they've lost much and discovered what can never be taken away: God's love. In Filipino culture, there's a word, bayanihan. It means community. It means lifting each other. It's the image of neighbors picking up a house, literally, and moving it together. But it's not just about buildings. It's about moving hearts. It's about carrying each other's burdens. It's about showing up when it's hard, about loving even when it costs. That's why when Filipinos leave their homeland, they don't leave their light behind. They bring it with them. They don't just blend in. They build faith communities where there were none. They build families of hope in the middle of despair. They bring laughter. They bring humility. They bring stories. They bring the Spirit. Yes, they bring their culture, but more than that, they bring Christ into homes, into hospitals, into heartbroken places where darkness thought it had already won. Jesus said in Mark 16:15, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation." Many hear this and think of pastors, of missionaries, of evangelists. But maybe, just maybe, God was also speaking to the ordinary, the caregiver, the nurse, the teacher, the cleaner, the father working abroad, the mother making sacrifices, people who may have simple jobs but carry extraordinary faith. Maybe the Philippines was never meant to only receive the gospel. Maybe it was always meant to be a sender, a lighthouse in the East, not just shining for itself, but casting its beam across oceans, into dark places, into forgotten lands, into silent rooms where someone is still praying to be seen. So the next time you walk into a church and see a Filipino choir singing, or a Filipino caregiver whispering a prayer over a patient, or a Filipino teacher telling a Bible story in a village school halfway across the world, remember, this is not coincidence. This is mission. This is prophecy. Not unfolding in cathedrals, but in kitchens. Not on stages, but in the quiet courage of everyday people. Because God doesn't always send armies. Sometimes he sends families. Sometimes he sends workers. Sometimes he sends those who have known pain, and because of that, know how to offer comfort. The story of the Philippines is a reminder. The greatest missionaries may not have titles or degrees. They may not speak from platforms. They may not wear robes or collars, but they carry the gospel wherever they go, in how they live, in how they serve, in how they love. And perhaps that is the most powerful mission of all. 5. Lessons from the Philippines for the world. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the sunrise over the Pacific, golden light spilling across the waves, thousands of islands, small, scattered, coming alive with color. To some, it's just a beautiful scene, a postcard moment, a tourist's dream. But to those who have eyes to see, it's something more. It's a metaphor, a quiet sermon from the Creator himself. A reminder that sometimes the smallest lights in the most overlooked places shine the brightest. The story of the Philippines isn't just about geography. It's not just about storms or gold or migration. It's a story of resilience, of grace, of a people who have learned how to find beauty in brokenness, who have discovered strength in surrender and joy in Jesus, even when everything else is stripped away. And that story doesn't belong to just one nation. It's a mirror, held up to the whole world, a message for all of us. Because if God can raise up missionaries from humble villages, if he can shine light through storm-scarred islands, if he can turn suffering into songs and hardship into hope, then what can he do with you? What can he do in your neighborhood, your city, your story? The Philippines teaches us something the world often forgets. You don't need to be powerful in the eyes of the world to have a place in God's plan. You don't need to be an empire. You don't need wealth. You don't need global influence. You can be a storm-battered archipelago, tucked quietly on the edge of the Pacific, and still become a lighthouse to the nations. The world often measures greatness by strength, by noise, by size. But the Philippines shows us a different kind of greatness, one measured not in riches, but in faithfulness, not in weapons, but in generosity, not in dominance, but in the quiet courage to shine, even when the storms come. It shows us that missionaries aren't always the ones sent by mission boards. Sometimes they're sent by life, by hardship, by circumstances that push them far from home. They didn't intend to preach. They didn't plan to become missionaries. They just lived. They just served. They just loved in hospital rooms, in classrooms, in quiet homes far from the islands they once called home. And somehow in doing so, they carried the gospel more powerfully than any sermon ever could. The Philippines teaches us something deeper still, that suffering is not our enemy. That pain, while real, can become a teacher. That trials, though fierce, can shape unbreakable faith. It reminds us that God's plan isn't something ancient, locked in the past. It's alive. It's still unfolding. Right now in places the world overlooks, through people the world underestimates. So what does that mean for you? Maybe you feel small. Maybe you feel unseen, ordinary, or unsure that your life matters in the grand scheme of things. But the story of the Philippines tells you, in God's eyes, nothing is too small. No place is too far. No person is too ordinary. David was just a boy with a sling. Esther, an orphan in exile. And the Philippines, a scattered group of islands, no stranger to storms. But all of them became part of God's story. All of them were placed in moments of history where their light could not be hidden. So maybe we've been asking the wrong question. Maybe the question isn't, is the Philippines mentioned in the Bible? Maybe the real question is, what can the world learn from the Philippines? Because the story of the Philippines is a story of faith, of resilience, of a people who didn't just survive storms, but shine through them. A reminder that no matter how fierce the wind, no matter how dark the night, the light of Christ shines brighter. That the gospel was never meant to stay locked in temples or cathedrals, but to be carried in hands that serve, in hearts that love, in lives that go where no one else dares to. And maybe, just maybe, the Philippines was chosen not just to receive the light, but to carry it, to share it, to remind the rest of us that this battle between light and darkness is still being fought. And it's being fought in the quiet corners of the world, in the back rooms of hospitals, in the kitchens of migrant homes, in places the headlines never mention, but heaven never forgets. So the next time you hear the words, go into all the world, don't just picture a preacher or a missionary. Picture a Filipino caregiver whispering a prayer, a nurse tending a wound, a teacher telling Bible stories in a language not their own. Then ask yourself, what about me? Where is my battlefield? Who in my life needs the light I've been given? What storm am I meant to endure? Not just for my own sake, but so that someone else can find hope in the middle of theirs? Because this story, the story of the Philippines, is not just their story, it's our story, it's God's story, and it's still being written. So now, pause, take a breath, let these stories settle. Let the whispers from across the ocean reach your heart. Maybe you never saw the Philippines this way before. Maybe, like many, you thought of it as a forgotten nation, a small, struggling country in the East. But now maybe you see something more. Not forgotten islands, but chosen vessels. Not victims of storms, but beacons through them. Not survivors, but messengers. Living proof that God still works in the margins, still calls the unlikely, still uses the overlooked. And maybe, just maybe, He wants to use you too. Because this story, this mission, isn't just for pastors. It's not just for prophets. It's for anyone willing to say, "Here I am, Lord. Use me." You may never sail across an ocean, but maybe your mission is right next door, in your home, in your workplace, in the silence of your own heart. Maybe your battlefield is the fear no one sees, or the sadness you've stopped talking about. But the Philippines reminds us, you can still shine, right where you are, right in the storm, right in the middle of your ordinary, everyday life. So I leave you with one question. What will you do with the light you've been given? Will you hide it, or will you let it shine, even when the storm rages? Even when the world says you're too small, too broken, too ordinary, because in God's eyes, you are none of those things. You are chosen, you are called, you are a living, breathing part of His story. And if the Philippines, a cluster of islands, battered but unbowed, can carry the gospel to the ends of the earth, what's stopping you?